on strategic litigation against public participation, or what we call SLAPP suits, which is a form of retaliation. Basically what this means, and we'll let the panelists really discuss this today and tomorrow, we have another panel on SLAPP suits. But what we wanted to talk about today is how the law is weaponized against whistleblowers and tries to silence them when they use their voice to speak truth to power. So I'm going to start with our online audience today. We have some panelists that are joining us virtually, and then we'll come back into the room for the panelists who are here in person. So I think our first panelist is Suelette Dreyfus, who is the Executive Director for Blueprint for Free Speech International in Australia. So if we can get Suelette, please introduce yourselves a little bit more, and we have about 10 minutes for each panelist.
Are you happy for me to jump in now? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, fantastic. Great. So hello, I'm in Australia, so it's evening here. It's very nice to be here, and I think this is a fantastic conference. So I'm the Executive Director of Blueprint for Free Speech. We are a sister NGO, and we spend a lot of time working with whistleblowers and advocating for better protection for whistleblowers. More recently, we've also been involved in trying to protect people from SLAPPs. SLAPP stands for Strategic Litigation or Lawsuits Against Participation. And it's really an appropriate acronym because SLAPPs are really about impacting almost a kind of violence, not a physical violence, but an emotional, a financial, an intellectual violence on people who challenge powerful actors in the public arena. That's what a SLAPP is. The phenomenon was first noticed really in the United States in the context of big multinationals challenging environmental activists, and then big business not wanting stories about corrupt practices coming into the public domain is another big category of SLAPPs. SLAPP litigants are usually powerful entities. They're often wealthy individuals or they're commercial concerns. And you can see political figures increasingly launching these sorts of suits, particularly in Europe. The key thing to know about a SLAPP, this sort of court case attack, is that unlike most court cases, the purpose is not necessarily to win. The purpose is not even to get justice. The purpose is to basically damage the other side by tying them up in expensive litigation, using up their resources, scaring them, cowering them, forcing them into a kind of silence. And it's been used in Europe most recently since 2016 onwards. There's been a six-fold increase by best estimates in the number of SLAPPs, largely against NGOs, but also against academic researchers and journalists, very much against journalists. So we've seen that in cases, for example, in Croatia, where there have been a number of cases, you've got one of the biggest protagonists of SLAPPs are actually judges. So they don't like what a journalist says about them, and so they slap them. And the idea is to shut them up. It's really a kind of, it's not exactly lawfare, but it is a warfare in law, in the sense that you're using these externalities, the legal system, to intimidate and deter to targets. So when I say externalities, I'm really talking about not what the law says or the case law. I'm saying about the cost. Fighting a defamation case in a country like the UK is just hundreds of thousands of pounds and huge psychological pressure. You're going to lose your house with the litigation. Your workmates may not speak to you. And you become a very divisive sort of figure. So it's important for people who are being slapped to understand that that's what's coming their way. Because the first time a journalist gets one of those letters, they don't necessarily know what it is. They just get this scary letter threatening legal action, expensive legal action against them. And they don't really understand that there are now literally law firms who have slapping as an economic model for how to sustain their legal practice financially. That is how they approach this. I'll just talk very briefly and then I'll hand the microphone back to you about our particular interest in SLAPPs. And I know that tomorrow, Philip Wissing from Blueprint, who is the head of our No SLAPP campaign in Germany, will talk more about what we're doing particularly there. But for the last 2 years, we have co-run a project across 11 countries in Europe with a set of other not-for-profit organizations and one university, which has trained more than 350 lawyers who will support civil society in what SLAPPs are and how to fight them. We've put together a free online curriculum, which includes cases from each country that are written up both in the country of origin's language as well as in English. And all of this is available at the PATFox, which is called the Pioneering Anti-SLAPP Freedom of Expression Project, so PATFox, but it's at antislapp.eu, and you'll be able to find the case studies and such written up there if you want to learn more about particular examples of it. But what we do know is that SLAPPs take advantage of elements of the legal system that are weak. So where you have inefficient court practices that drag out cases and you have lots of stop-starts to the cases, so this can go on for years, which is a form of torture on the recipients of this sort of thing. And remember, at the heart of many SLAPP cases is a whistleblower. And that's because the whistleblower has given the information often to the environmental NGO, as we see in SLAPP cases in Germany, to the academic researcher, as we see in cases in Poland regarding LGBTI or historical accuracy reporting, as we see in inappropriate development in communities that have historic buildings and characters along the coast of Croatia, as well as against many journalists in Croatia, as we saw in Malta with regards to the assassinated journalist who Daphne Caruana Galizia, who you will probably all be familiar with. But, you know, when she died, she had more than 40 defamation libel cases against her, and those were really SLAPPs. But Malta has this weird law where when you die, those cases actually go to your heirs. So her children have had to fight off these terrible cases in the years following her death, in addition to dealing with the tragedy of her death. In some countries, including to some degree Australia, but certainly the US, there are pretty good protections against SLAPPs, but that hasn't been the case in Europe. California has probably the best legislation, anti-SLAPP legislation. But in Europe, it really hasn't been the case. And so that's one reason why a set of civil society organizations from around Europe lobbied very hard over the last few years to get an EU anti-SLAPP directive. And I'm pleased to say that that was passed earlier this year. And what that means is that 27 countries in the EU will have to pass national legislation in their country, which reflects what is in the EU directive as a mandatory minimum set of requirements of protections against SLAPP. Now, it's not perfect. And of course, when these directives are passed, as we saw with the EU Whistleblower Protection Directive, that we were also quite involved in the civil society movement to get passed, the transposition of the law to national legislation is not always all that we hope it will be. It's not always compliant with the directive. It's certainly not always on time. And I believe that local people here today will be able to speak about that transposition in Greece. But, you know, not unique in that. Spain transposed it late and not very well. And so there are a number of countries that have been, in a sense, reluctant brides to this marriage of trying to defend whistleblowers. And I expect will be the same with the EU directive. But the EU directive does have some positive components to it. And among those is it does provide, it doesn't provide as much as the Council of Europe recommendations, which is a bit unfortunate. We would like a little bit more than that. But it does provide some improvements about cross-border cases, which is where someone might, in a sense, shop for the best country to run a SLAPP case against someone. It may not be a country where the offense has actually taken place, where the plaintiff is, where the defendant is. It's really just about choosing a place that will cause maximum havoc. You have to pay for translations for every court document, for example, to the person, often the journalist, who's on the receiving end of it. And there are a set of other components that do improve it somewhat. But we still have a ways to go, and it's a baseline. The way to view it as it's a baseline, we need to get it implemented, and then we need to figure out how we ramp it up to something of a higher standard. I hope that gives you the very fast tour of what the EU directive on SLAPPs is, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions if I can.
Okay, thank you for that. Do we want to do any questions for Suelette from the audience? And I don't know if, is Tom Devine on the line?
While you're waiting for him, I might just add to say that the Council of Europe has made recommendations which are non-binding, unlike the EU directive will be in terms of national transposition. But they are a bit broader and they offer a little bit better protection. So the scope of the application of the new legislation in the directive is pretty good. It applies to all public watchdogs, but it only provides to civil proceedings. Whereas the Council of Europe recommendations, which again, non-binding, but they are useful and can be cited obviously in legal arguments. And it applies to all proceedings, including criminal and administrative as well. There is an early dismissal mechanism, which is in the Council of Europe recommendations. That's really one of the key things that you want in SLAPP legislation, is a way before you inflict the pain of, the cost of lawyers, the risk, the stress, the time on the journalist or the whistleblower or the NGO or the academic who's getting slapped, is to get in there early and get the court to rule, no. We need to be able to do an early dismissal because this is just a slab. In the EU directive, there are different measures that apply to, quote, abusive proceedings and manifestly unfounded proceedings against public participation, but it's perhaps not as wide as one might hope. But both of them do include measures against this third country slapping activity that can occur. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more detail.
Thank you. And I think, Ari, you had a question?
First of all, I'd like to personally welcome Suelette. We go back since 2016, and I consider her one of my mentors. So I would like to say that. I have learned a lot from Dr.Suelette Dreyfus. In fact, she was one of the persons that introduced me to NGOs and the precious work they're doing to support freedom of expression of speech. I would also like to mention that Dr.Suelette Dreyfus is a member of our Liberty of Speech organization, and we don't like to advertise it too much. Dr. Suelette likes to be on the side, and very humble of her. And Suelette, what strikes me is the way you described SLAPP suit. Purpose is not to win. It is not to get justice. It is to create a retaliation. Am I right? And that's something that, we need to sit a bit there and understand what does the SLAPP suit is there for, what is designed, what is its purpose, okay? Because we're going to speak about the effects of SLAPP suit as part of a long, length lawsuit against whistleblowers, the effect it has on whistleblowers. Now, why I'm saying that, because in Greece, justice delayed is justice denied. And we have an issue in many other countries, like South Africa, where a whistleblower will drag himself to court for up to 10 years, 5 years to 10 years, in order to get justified. And we need to know what is the resulting PTSD that we're going to introduce later, the resulting psychological effect on the whistleblowers. That is something to keep a mental memory, and we're going to come forward and discuss it later on. Thank you so much for your time. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ari. Is Tom Devine online? Okay, so if we can figure that out. So we'll skip back over. I know he's here because he's in the room and I can see him. Nikolaos Leontopoulos is from Reporters United here in Greece, and I believe he has some SLAPP experience he wanted to share as well.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. My name is Nikolaos. I'm a reporter in Greece. I'm a co-founder, reporter, and in Reporters United, which is a Greek investigative journalism project that started back in 2019 as a legal entity, and then it went online in 2020. We are not the only project in Greece. It's fair to say that despite the huge problems journalism has been having in Greece in the last years, and SLAPP is fundamentally one of them, there is what I would call a blossoming scene, ecosystem of investigative journalism happening right now in Greece. It's not just Reporters United. There is Inside Story. There is Solomon, which is also a great investigative project that won 3 awards in the European Press Prize last week. There is Manifold, there is Mir, there are many projects, there are many independent journalists working as freelancers. There is a new generation of investigative journalists, some of them working for mainstream media in a very repressive environment, I would say, because as people in the room might know, most mainstream media in Greece have very close political and business ties to the governments, all governments, but also to business interests. But going back to the SLAPP experience, of course, I could speak on an institutional level about the transposition of the European directive in Greece, but for me that's not the main issue. I'll just say 2 words. Like in all EU member states, the directive came into the parliaments in 2019. There was 1 year to transpose it. Most EU members did not do it. Greece was one of them. Actually, the Greek government made a huge effort first to delay its transposition, then to soften its content, and then even to sabotage its implementation. Now the EU directive is a Greek law, but to my knowledge there is very small use of it. But for me the big issue in Greece is not the transposition of the directive, but it's the experience with SLAPPs. So I will talk a little bit of our own experience as Reporters United. Some might know it, there's been a lot of international coverage. In the last 3 years in Greece, one of the biggest political issues that we had was what international media coined the Greek Watergate. It was essentially a story of the Greek government in a massive and systematic way using an illegal spyware software called Predator to spy on almost everybody that has a high political value in Greece. They were spying on their own ministers. They were spying on major business people in Greece. They were spying on publishers. They were spying on investigative journalists. They were spying on the chiefs of the army. And actually this was proven. We know for a fact that this was illegal. We know that there's been involvement in that from the Prime Minister's office and from one of the most powerful people in Greece back then, who was the General Secretary of the Prime Minister and at the same time his nephew, and also of the Greek spy service. We would call it the Greek CIA or the Greek NSA. And this leads to Reporters United experience with SLAPPs, because what essentially happened was that we started reporting on the surveillance scandal, on the spying scandal in January 2022. There were only 2 small outlets in Greece that were reporting on that. There was Reporters United and there was Inside Story, another small outlet. We were revealing information about spying on journalists and so on for 8 months to a complete media silence in Greece. There was nobody that was eager to republish the information that we're publishing until August 2022, when this became a huge political scandal because it was revealed that also the leader of the opposition had been targeted while he was an MEP in the European Parliament. He had been targeted with the same spyware. And then something great for journalism happened. On August 4, we published an investigative report alleging links between the General Secretary of the Prime Minister and the people who brought and used the spyware in Greece, alleging direct and indirect links with multiple people and companies. On the following day, Mr. Dimitriadis, the General Secretary of the Prime Minister's office, and his nephew quit, and on the same day, he filed a defamation lawsuit against Reporters United, which was essentially a SLAPP lawsuit. It was not the first time. Actually, one of the interesting things happening right now in European journalism, but especially in Greece, is that people who want to slap you, they attack you even before you publish, which means that the moment you send questions, and you send questions because you want to respect the right of reply of the people who are involved in your reporting, the moment you send questions to them, they slap you. The same happened in the surveillance scandal, but what was even worse was that after publishing, we got the first SLAPP suit. This one was for more than €1 million. Essentially, we have two big SLAPP suits from this person, from Dimitriadis, for more than €3.3 million. They are not just against Reporters United, they are also against other journalists. For example, one of the victims of the surveillance scandal, Thanasis Koukakis, was slapped with a defamation lawsuit, not because he wrote a story about Dimitriadis, but because he reproduced with a tweet the story that we did. And now he's also in courts. So there are, in total, there are two SLAPP suits, total more than €3.5 million. To give you a comparison, our annual budget is €150,000, the annual budget of Reporters United. The first one was tried January 2022. The second one is going to be tried towards the end of 2020. The first one was tried in 2024. The second one is to be tried towards the end of 2024. The problems are well known, what it means to be slapped. It's a huge waste of resources. It's a huge waste of money. You need to prepare to go in court. Actually, one of the biggest paradoxes of the Greek Watergate scandal for me is that actually more than 2 years after we first started reporting on that, the only people that are being dragged in court are either the journalists that wrote about the story, or people in Greek institutions like the Independent Authority for the Privacy of Telecommunications that try to do something on an institutional level to find out what the story was about. And they were also dragged in courts as potential sources leaking official secrets to the journalist. Not one of the people implicated in the scandal, the politician, the businessman who brought Predator in Greece, the operatives, has not even summoned by the Greek justice, not even as witnesses, let alone as suspects or any indictment against them or whatever. The consequences are well known. It's not a Greek issue, it's an international issue. It's the so-called chilling effect. As I already said, there is a huge problem with the waste of resources because you spend enormous amount of time to prepare for your SLAPP suit. In our own case, the 3 reporters that were working on the stories, it was with Thodoris Kondrogianos and with Christoforos Kasdaglis, we spent a lot of time not just reporting but then preparing the lawsuit. But there is also another consequence that is very grave in my view, is the way that this new mentality of fear will infiltrate the newsroom. You get slapped once, you get slapped a second time, a third time, and at one time the people in your newsroom start to be afraid of what's going to come next, which means that they will be much more cautious when they pick the next story, which means that if we have a next big story, we will be super cautious with the kind of headline we have, or we will edit again and again our story so that it gets a lot of attention from our lawyer so that it's a safe story. In the end, the real risk is that you stop doing your journalism, or that your journalism is becoming very boring, so boring that the lawyers will accept it for publishing, but the audience will find it dull. A little note on that. When we started, our main problem was that nobody was taking us seriously. We would send questions, they would not reply. We would publish something big, nobody would notice. Legacy media would not reproduce our stories. Now, 4 years later, I'm really proud not just of Reporters United, but also of the other great projects that are happening now in the country, that the work we are trying to do has real impact. This is why I would say that if I were to choose between a situation of silence and SLAPPs, I would still go for the SLAPPs. It's silence in Greek journalism and in the Greek political system is silence that is really deafening and really scary and disturbing. A couple of months ago, we published a story that personally I'm very proud of our project that we were able to publish it, and especially of the young colleague who is under than 30 years old, and he had the guts to go into investigating such a difficult story. We published a story about the ties between 3 of the top businessmen in Greece, owning the biggest media groups, owning the biggest football clubs. There are direct and indirect ties with mobsters, with mafia people that had been assassinated in the last year. I was shocked when I realized that we spent 6 months, 9 months investigating, editing, writing, publishing the story, and on the following day there was not one reproduction in the Greek media about what we had published. So in my view, if I had to choose between silence and SLAPPs, I would go with the SLAPPs. Last very brief comment. I know that I have abused the time, but I would like to make a bridge with whistleblowers. In the surveillance story, whistleblowers were very important. Sources, anonymous sources that had credible information in all the stories we do. Actually, tomorrow, my colleague from Reporters United, Gianni Luludi, will present, I think for the first time in Greece, our new open platform for whistleblowers, which is the first platform of the kind in Greece. It's the first time in Greece that you have a platform for whistleblowers. But the bridge I would like to make is that there is a paradox for which I think journalists are to blame. On the one side, we protest a lot about SLAPPs, but on the other side, I feel that the spectrum of media freedom, freedom of speech, not just in Greece, but this is a phenomenon that I see happening a lot in all Western liberal democracies, and especially in the places where it should not happen, like the US, for example, or more developed than Greece, Western democracies in Europe. So, in the name of this so-called campaign for disinformation that we have seen happening from 2016 onwards, what we see is that gradually the space for media freedom is getting narrow and narrow and narrow and narrow. Whistleblowers and sanctions against whistleblowers and against sources, despite the directives, despite the legislation, are getting more and more sanctioned. It's not just in Greece. It's also in the US, it's also in France, it's also in Germany, it's also in the UK. And sometimes as journalists we say this is a good thing because we have to fight fake news, because we have to fight disinformation and all that. But in my view, it's like journalists, we are shooting our own feet. What we need is more media freedom, more freedom of speech. And if we have more media freedom, more freedom of speech, then of course it's easier then to go out in the public and protest against SLAPPs and create coalitions against SLAPPs and bring like the new directive, the new initiative of the European Commission against SLAPPs. Then it makes more sense. Thank you.
So before you go away, I just had a quick thought and a quick question. So one, I really appreciated what you just said, and we had Vlad and Dragana on earlier from Serbia, who said that they started their whistleblowing journey as journalists and then turned into whistleblowers because of the censorship in the media. How do you see SLAPPs affecting the organizations of, the media organizations, sometimes these big conglomerates, as opposed to the freelancer or the journalists themselves? How are you sort of dealing with those two different entities. Because you can slap the journalist individually, but you can also slap the media company.
Well, it's a very interesting question because in Greece, so that I understand that most of the public is foreign, so they don't know about the Greek characteristics of the media landscape. One of the most important things to know is that in Greece we have legacy media like everywhere in the world, big newspapers, big TV stations, etc. And almost all of them, all of the media that are publishing on a national broadcast level and are private, all of them are owned by important, influential business people. Actually, an interesting statistic is that we have 6 TV stations, big private TV stations. 5.5 out of 6 are owned by ship owners. And given that Greek shipping is the #1 shipping industry in the world, you understand what kind of suffocation for freedom of expression this creates in the Greek public discourse if the media are controlled by those people. This also means that if you have an attack, a slap against one of those media, it's a completely different story than having a slap against Reporters United, Solomon, Inside Story, etc. It's not just a matter of resources. It's the fact that those media are so close to power that they have a completely different approach in how to deal with power. I would even dare say that they have also a different access on a judicial level. And of course, they have the resources to pay for it. For us, it's always very difficult. They have the resources to spend time on it. And most importantly, what is very interesting for me is that in Greece, when you see the difficult stories, like it was the surveillance story, like you have environmental stories that have to do with shipping, we have very few examples of legacy media that are doing those stories, and we have small media, again, like Reporters United, Solomon, etc., that are doing the stories. Actually, to be very brief on that, it's quite astonishing to me that it's these small, independent, almost inexistent ecosystem of media that has been working, collaborating on international networks with foreign media. It's not the big legacy media. You have networks like IKE with Spiegel and Mediapart, ICIJ with the Pandora Papers, Panama Papers. All those international networks in Greece are cooperating not with the big TV stations or with the big TV newspapers, but with media as Reporters United, Solomon, Inside Story, and so on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did anybody else have any questions for the panelists?
I'm just going to make a comment.
Okay, Hari.
Nikolaos, so in conclusion, do you agree that SLAPP suits?
Why don't you come up to the... Okay.
Then I'll speak later. Just want to give that question.
Trying to get you on camera.
So, would you agree that the definition of SLAPP suits can be the extermination of the freedom of expression or speech?
Well, I wouldn't go so far, but again, I'm repeating our experience. You start a story. I mean, Greek journalists are quite good, but to be fair with ourselves, for example, the right of reply has been a practice that we hadn't been practicing in the old decades, let's say. Now, new journalists are doing it. The moment you send questions to an important person in Greece, you run the risk that you are being slapped. Sometimes you are slapped with a legal document, which is like a pre-lawsuit. Sometimes you are slapped because you get an aggressive email that actually threatens to bring you in court. Sometimes you are slapped even over a phone call. I have the experience of writing about recycling in Greece, and one of the biggest lawyers in Greece, a TV persona, probably that most people in Greece would easily identify who is it, called us and started threatening the young colleague of mine, Theodoros Kondrogianos, who back then was 28 years old, that he would end his career if he went on with the story just because we sent questions. So, of course, this is the answer to your question.
But now I'm going to make another important point, which I personally have suffered, although only in South Africa. It's the character assassination campaign by fake news media and what I call the power of the pen to retaliate against whistleblowers. So we also have now, and I'm making the devil's advocate, another side where some journalists with compromised values can target people of interest and create a characterization of fake news media. So where's the balance?
Well, there is no way I would defend those journalists. Actually, one of the most bold moves we've been doing in our journalists is writing about conflicts of interest of journalists themselves. Because in Greece you have the phenomenon that you have a journalist writing for a mainstream newspaper and at the same time working for a minister or for the prime minister and writing on the same topic that he's covering as a journalist, also working with his prime minister. So I understand what you are saying. But, for example, in the surveillance scandal, when we first started reporting on this, it was Christmas 2021 to 2022. We hadn't even published, but we had started asking the difficult questions to people. We didn't know what we were after because we didn't know what was lying beneath. We had no idea. You know what happened? One of the biggest newspapers in Greece published a series of reports, not against us because we were too insignificant, against the independent authorities that were already trying to investigate the story, accusing people that are beyond doubt about their honesty, about their decency, about their track record in Greek institutions, accusing them of helping terrorists, of being traitors of Turkey, of helping jihadists run into Greece, things like that. And this was the environment when we started publishing on that. And even when I went to ask friends of mine, their opinion was formed by such character assassination attacks.
Thank you. Loud and clear.
Could I jump in for just a minute and add something to that about what Nikolaos was talking about with the spyware? I mean, it's clear that SLAPPs are a more sophisticated way to get at whistleblowers and their publishers. And an even more sophisticated way still is things like predator spyware. But they are all intertwined. And it has become so bad, this kind of attack on media freedom, on the right to publish, not just the right to freedom of expression, but the right to publish so others understand what is going on with corruption, et cetera, that even, the U.S. government has sanctioned the company behind the notorious predator spyware. And they did not only the company, which was Intellexa Consortium, but a set of their holding companies, including Intellexa SA in Greece and a subsidiary in Hungary and Ireland. But the point is that when you're the U.S. government and you sanction not only the company, but the people behind the company, the owner, the founder, the corporate offshoring specialist providing managerial services, that is a pretty serious business. To convince the U.S. government to do that is like, you must be doing something really questionable to do that. And the fact that it has done this, I think, has in many ways surprised civil society and perhaps even the media, because it's such a progressive move in defense of the media. It's not perhaps what people were expecting if you're from a small independent NGO or small independent investigative journalist organization. But it's a good thing because not only does it sanction the largest providers of these weapons, and they are cyber weapons. I mean, I have a background in computer security, so I have some familiarity with them. And they are cyber weapons designed to inflict the same kind of, penalties and costs on independent journalists and whistleblowers, just like SLAPPs. But the idea that you would actually say a government like the U.S. would sanction them is quite powerful, not just for the sanctioning, but for the public message it sends. So although there is lots of doom and gloom and many reasons to feel sad and unhappy about the state of the world and the direction it's heading in, there are little bright points, and that is one, and so is, I think, passing the EU directive and the Council of Europe recommendations. So I guess I'm saying we shouldn't give up hope entirely.
No, I don't think we should give up hope entirely, because then we wouldn't have our voices. We're going to take a few minutes of a break because we want to keep online for the live stream. So like 8 minutes, and then Ari and I are actually going to switch places. And I'm going to be on the next panel. We're going to come back and talk about traumatic stress, family resilience, and suicide prevention, the human factor.